Now, just to mention dreams, because a lot of people say, well, you can't have had an out-of-body experience because you've got no eyes. You need your eyes to be able to see if you've gone somewhere else. Well, what about dreams? You don't have your eyes open when you have a dream, but you haven't physically gone anywhere else.
Yeah.
But there's a lot. I mean, Sheldrake says he thinks that if you're having a dream and you happen to die while you're having a dream, that you continue dreaming after you've died. So your body's dead, you're gone, you've been buried, and that dream continues on. What do you think of that, Andrew?
Yeah, well, he does say that, and I think, if you look at the near-death experience, the most automatic response is that it's not, near-death experiences are not real, they're just dreams. They're just hallucinatory experiences. And as you say, the dream state is a whole other conversation. And I haven't really put much about dreams in this book. I didn't really get into that at all. But just everyone does experience a dream at some time in their lives, and you experience sensory information without your senses really being active, and just occasionally you'll get crossovers from your real senses into your dream. I remember having a dream once where I heard this sort of rustling noise or this motor noise, and I woke up, and then there used to be this factory across from the back of where my bedroom was, and you could hear this fan going, and that had come into my dream. So I was getting crossover information from my dream and real world sensory information as I was waking up. But in the dream state, you can have all the senses seem to give you input in the dream, yet you're unconscious. So it's certainly not a black and white situation. And then, of course, he talks about these morphogenetic fields, and it's in this area where he sort of points out that if you look at aspects of our consciousness, you can't really explain them by genetics alone. And one of the really interesting things that I think Rupert Sheldrake says is everyone accepts that DNA, the DNA encodes what we are as human beings. So we have DNA in every cell of our body, and you can, each person has a DNA fingerprint that, your DNA is different to my DNA, but it's like 99.9% the same, but there are enough differences that we can use it for a forensic sort of evidence. But what he says is that although DNA will say how to build a cell or whatever, there's nothing in the DNA which dictates the morphology of the human body. The DNA doesn't dictate how our arms appear in relation to our legs. That isn't encoded in the DNA. So it's like the DNA sort of encodes the bricks, but it doesn't encode the design of the house, as it were.
Yeah, he says that the cells in the arms are the same as the cells in the legs. There's no difference to them at all.
Exactly.
So how does it know it's an arm cell or a leg cell?
Yeah, where does the information come from that actually gives us a human form, a bipedal humanoid form? And he argues that these morphogenetic fields have information in them which kind of like build up over time, and that itself is all part of the consciousness puzzle, and that aspects of our consciousness too therefore must be in these what he calls morphogenetic fields, or something like this. And I mean, while we're on that sort of area, one of the good scientific areas of study which I think kind of proves that to some degree is this idea of cellular memory. If you have a heart transplant and you receive a heart from a donor, there's been multiple recorded instances now where the receiver of the heart starts to take on characteristics and sometimes memories from the donor. They'll develop a liking for a certain type of crisps, or they'll develop certain mannerisms or certain behaviours, and those behaviours are then found to have been ones which the donor had. but the person that receives the heart or the liver has no knowledge of who the donor was. In fact, that information is normally, in most cases, kept confidential. So how can it be that this person, like there's one well-known story where a man received the heart from somebody who was shot in the face and killed, and he went, he was going to the bathroom in the morning, looking in the mirror and seeing himself being shot in the face, and this became very difficult for him to deal with. So this again seems to sort of imply that parts of our consciousness get they impinge on the cells and the organs of our body, but science has no obvious mechanism for this. And again, Rupert Sheldrake argues that because we've got these morphogenetic fields, it's a two-way thing. So we can put things into the morphogenetic field and things come out of the morphogenetic field that affect us too. And so he argues that with the cellular memory, that's evidence of a morphogenetic field at work, in that we are receiving information from the morphogenetic field, because that was actually the heart, the old heart, the donor's heart was in a different morphogenetic field, and we then experience that when it becomes our heart.
Now, you discuss religion in your book, Andrew, and you look for references about consciousness and also reincarnation. So I'm just going to read a quote which comes from Douglas Gibson that you've got in your book.
Yes, Douglas.
He says, "The Bible has been edited down a lot over the centuries, but did originally contain references to reincarnation. An eye for an eye was originally a reference to karma, not some vengeful god. People are much easier to control if they believe they have only one life. The Catholic Church has understood this from the beginning. We have to be extremely careful not to throw out Christianity itself, but the Catholic Church has gone to really extreme lengths over the centuries to destroy all knowledge of reincarnation. The Essens, the Albigensians, the Cathars, the Knights Templar, and the Rosicrucians were all Christian sects that believed in reincarnation, all ruthlessly destroyed by the Catholic Church. The Anthroposophical Society is currently the main organisation flying the flag for Christian reincarnation. I'm surprised Steiner House in London hasn't been burned down yet." So, yeah, he's basically saying that the Abrahamic religions, let's say, really have been messed with for agendas of human beings. And I would go along with that. And I just want to mention the book Gods of the Bible by Mauro Biglino. And somebody informed me about this book, and I read it, and this book really was a massive eye-opener for me. And it's going to be covered in my next book. And what it does is it basically explains the origin of the Abrahamic religions, and the Old Testament, and the oldest version of the Old Testament, he's translated it literally and spelled out exactly what it's saying, and it's a completely different story to the modern day Abrahamic religions. They were not talking about what people think. I'm not going to go into it here because it's not part of this interview, but I mean, it overlaps with some of Sitchin's work and people like von Daniken and others who, and it just paints a completely different picture of what was going on the planet 1000 BC and earlier. So yeah, but you seem to have more respect for other religions such as Hinduism. You think that reincarnation's been left in there, and there's a quote about Hinduism. This quote comes from Sean McHugh, who says that Hinduism isn't an organized religion and only assists personal inquiry. It has no founder, no prophets, no overall leaders, no regulating institutions, no historical events to accept, no single theological and no ethical system. It also has no identifying clothes, while for much of its history it even had no name to demark and separate it from other religions. So yeah, we can see that it's, in other words, to summarize, it's remained true to itself, let's say. So do you just want to explain what it says about reincarnation? It basically says it's true that we reincarnate through many different bodies, and you believe that, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I think Hinduism seems to me to encompass many of the ideas and beliefs which I've kind of come around to, but from not from knowing about Hinduism or being, studying Hinduism even. I mean, I was brought up a Roman Catholic, and we were never really taught about reincarnation. And the only way that you pick up the idea is, you hear these conversations like, you hear some very worldly wise young child, he's been here before, she's been here before, or whatever, or in my next life I want to come back as a dog, or something, or a cat, or whatever it is. But with I've obviously digressed from Hinduism, but again, if you look at Hinduism as a whole, there is lots of stuff in it. There is stories of these Vimanas, for example, in their scriptures. The Vedic scripts talk about basically flying saucers or spaceships back in ancient times. So Hinduism seems to have just about everything in it, and yet it isn't something that is. As Sean says, he's the expert, one of the experts on Hinduism that I've been lucky enough to correspond with, and that's why I included that quote, that I think that Hinduism seems to be more about personal discovery and being enlightened within yourself than having to accept, that you are ruled over by a discarnate male entity known as God, or some version of that, which is what most of the Abrahamic religions are centered around. And they don't really, you never really are taught about this idea that you might have past life memories. In fact, if you do have anything that seems to resemble a past life memory, then you've probably been possessed by a demon. That is one of the extreme views in Christianity, or it's just not taken seriously, and you assume that you've just got this coincidental memory of some kind. But I think the evidence for reincarnation is now very, very strong in various cases. Right.
So you look at a number of cases of people who it is claimed have been reincarnated. One of them claiming to be his own grandfather, and another one, various other ones where the evidence you think is compelling.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the most compelling ones that I've ever come across was actually featured on the. We will have mentioned this program on Rich Planet before, is the Michael Aspel Strange But True series, and that's where I first heard of it. And this is the case of Jenny Cockell, who I think was from Northampton originally, and she had long-standing past life memories of having to leave behind some children, and these were very powerful emotional memories that she had. And over a period of, I think, quite a few years, decades even, she was able to piece together memories, and not through having hypnotic regression. These were just from dreams and from just visions that she'd had. And she had a vision of a village in Ireland, and she sort of somehow got a map of this village in her mind, and then she ended up finding out which this village was, which was a village of Malahide, which is north of Dublin. And then she went there and she recognised the village, and over a period of time and several visits, she was able to establish that in her past life she was a lady called Mary Sutton, and she died, I think, at the age of 36, 37. And she had, I think, 5 children who were left behind, and I think 4 of these children had to go and live in an orphanage, and one of the children went to live with their father. This child was called Sonny, and to make a long story short, she eventually managed to find all these children. They were still living, and she reunited them all, and not all of them were in contact with each other, and she was able to describe to Sonny, the eldest, a situation where they trapped a hare, and there was this was a powerful memory for them for some reason, and this convinced Sonny that indeed Jenny Cockell was the reincarnation of their mother, and there were other memories as well, And she wrote a book about this. Jenny Cockell wrote a book, and it was made into a film. And you can watch that film. It's called Yesterday's Children, and it's actually got Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour plays Jenny Cockell in this film. Of course, Jane Seymour was in the James Bond film. So that, if you look at the evidence in that story, to me, the only way to explain it is that Mary Sutton, some of her consciousness ended up in Jenny Cockell. I don't think there's any other logical way to explain it.
Right, and there are other compelling cases as well.
There are others as well, yes, indeed. I think one of the other ones which I talked about in the consciousness presentation many years ago that I did is the case of James Leininger. Now he there's another interesting element of his case as well, which I only discovered in doing the research for the book. So James Leininger, his parents found that when he was about 2-3 years old, he was obsessed with planes. He was absolutely obsessed with planes, and then he started to reenact being trapped inside a plane set and saying he can't get out, he can't get out, he can't get out. And and then as he got older and his language improved, he started to tell his parents that he'd been shot down. And he said, well, where were you shot down? And he said, well, I was at sea. And he says, well, how you were at sea? And he says, oh, well, I flew from a ship. And of course, this was an aircraft carrier. And they said, well, what was the name of the ship? And the ship was the Natoma. And they basically, over a period of time, he started coming out with these names, and he was able to name members of the crew of the ship. I think Fred Mywold was one of them. And he came out with all these names and all these details, and they all checked out. All of these details checked out. And again, this information was not obtained through hypnotic regression. He was too young to have been able to read any of the books where he could have found this information. And they even describe a situation where the guy that he was the reincarnation of, he was also called James. James Huston was the name of the pilot that actually was shot down in the circumstances in which James Leininger described. James Huston had a sister, and James Leininger and his parents went to see this sister. They found out where she lived, and they went to see her. And James Leininger even knew that she had this painting of another sibling, tucked away in her loft. He knew that she had this painting, and that no one else knew that she had this. So it was a very private bit of information. So that, to me, is clear evidence that somehow if it wasn't what you'd call reincarnation, then it was something that happened which looked exactly the same as reincarnation. Okay, you might explain it as he was able to somehow to access the Akashic records or something, but whatever it was, it's an amazing thing which is not commonly explained by science, and evidentially it was solid.
Right.
The other interesting thing which came out in the research in that story was that James Leininger one day said to his mum and dad, well, I'm glad that I picked you as my parents. And they said, well, what do you mean? He says, well, I saw you. And says, what do you mean you saw us? Well, I saw you at this hotel, I think it was called the Pink Hotel in Hawaii. And this was where they went. They went to the Pink Hotel in Hawaii before James Leininger was born, and he knew, and he said he saw them there. So then you get into this situation of, well, how could he have seen them? So it seems that his consciousness was disembodied, was not even in his body, and yet he was able to find information about his parents before he was even born. So,
really, you need to read the whole book if you want to get a grasp of it all. Now, one thing that you do discuss in the book is drugs, and one drug, DMT, dimethyltryptamine. And Andrew says in his book, when a person is under the influence of DMT, they report various unusual effects, such as coming into contact with intelligent but distinctly non-human entities. Some people seem to be able to communicate with their spirit guide, or even with an entity known in Gnostic teachings as Sophia. Now, and some drugs are alleged to create an expanded state of consciousness to allow you to experience something that you don't have access to without them. Now, I guess the question is, does the drug merely interrupt your brain and senses, and therefore what you experience is not reality, it's just a hallucination? Or is the drug enhancing your ability to see and experience things that are real that you cannot perceive without the drug, and it actually enhances your awareness of reality? So you've looked at various different drugs and claims of researchers who've looked into it, Andrew, and you discuss psychedelics, mescaline, LSD, iboga, Dr. Timothy Leary, Aldous Huxley, people who've taken drugs, Terence McKenna, Graham Hancock, and others. So, do you want to give us an appraisal of?
Yeah. So I mean,
make the case that for drugs.
Well, I think the underlying theme with these substances when you ingest them is that, as we're talking about, they change your state of consciousness, and you become aware of things that you're not aware of when you haven't had the drug. That's the sort of basic thing that you can say. And if you read, for example, the account of Aldous Huxley in his book Doors of Perception, he talks about, for example, becoming. He was just sat in a chair taking mescaline, which comes from the peyote root, and it was isolated in the 1800s, I think, this substance. And he just describes sitting in the chair, and suddenly he becomes aware of various things. It becomes such a meaningful thing that this chair exists, and he also describes loss of a sense of time. And so, and colours become more vibrant, and it just changes what he perceives as being important in the world. And so it's like he just becomes aware of that everything is part of a larger system of reality, and there's more to things than just like the physical hardness of objects. They exist in ways other than just what we would normally see when we don't have our consciousness altered by these substances. And again, that sort of experience seems to be even more powerful when you either smoke dimethyltryptamine or it's injected intravenously. And it's like you go off on this trip and you encounter these beings, and they've been described in various ways. Some Rick Strassman's accounts that are in his book, The Spirit Molecule. The people that took part in his trials of DMT report meeting these beings that are like greys, like grey aliens. Mm-hmm. And he even draws a parallel between some of the abduction experiences and the experiences that his volunteers described when he'd been given, I think, 40 milligrams of DMT. And the thing is with these beings that you get the distinct impression that they are interested in you. They're interested in you, and they have their own lives going on. And the other thing that's interesting that's described in those experiences is that you really need to read his book to get all of this, is that you can have one experience and then that finishes, and then you can have a subsequent experience, and it appears that these beings sometimes pick up where they left off, as if they're kind of waiting for you to come back into this realm of expanded consciousness. Some of the people reported on that. So it's like you experience this changed reality, and obviously you can't bring anything of that back directly into our normal waking reality. You can only bring a description, an impression that you can impart to others. It's not. This is where it gets so difficult. It can all be dismissed as a hallucination, because you can't bring a piece of physical evidence back from this higher realm or whatever it is. All you can bring back is information. So that is always going to be the difficulty with verifying these sorts of accounts. Many of them can only be, at the very least, partly verified, because people have similar experiences, people from diverse cultures and diverse interests. So when you study these experiences collectively, the idea that they're hallucinations becomes much less likely.
Right, and the problem is that a lot of people who have these experiences will say, I can't explain what it is to you without you experiencing it yourself. You have to experience it. You can't debunk it unless you've done it yourself, because I can't really explain what it's like to experience this sort of awareness. Not that that's the right word, but so, and it's interesting that you make the point that generally in our culture it's the drugs that don't produce these effects are the ones that are legal.
That's right. I mean, this is, many people have argued this. Terence McKenna, Timothy Leary, Graham Hancock's argued this, that it's really bears some study. We need to study these effects, not sort of shut them down. And indeed, to extend on that, the psychedelic substances a little bit more, in more recent years, there has been some openings because, for example, very serious sort of mental health conditions like schizophrenia, it seems that if you give them psychedelics, it's almost like it reprograms their neurology, and because they've experienced these states of expanded consciousness, this can somehow sort of reset whatever it is in the brain that causes schizophrenia. And there is another case which I discuss in the book, and I recommend that people watch this film. It's a fairly recent film called Dosed, and it was independently produced, and it follows the story of a drug addict. I think she was actually a heroin addict called Adrienne, and from Vancouver, and she has a very serious heroin addiction, and she's given methadone as well, because that's one of the prescription drugs that they give to treat heroin addiction, although it doesn't really treat it. And she really got to the point where her life had got to the point where she knew she was going to just commit suicide. And so they initially started giving her psilocybin, which is another psychedelic, which is found in these magic mushrooms. And this had a small effect on her, but it didn't break her addiction to heroin. But ultimately, if you watch the whole film, she ends up being taken to this place, this therapy, this place where they give therapy in what's called ibogaine or iboga, which is another plant extract. And this is a very powerful, I've not heard of this before I watched this film. And so they give her this drug in a ceremony, and they actually give her it before she's completely clean of the heroin. And it does have a very profound effect on her. But after a period of time, she does go back and she takes the heroin. But then, I think a month or a couple of months later, she's got the heroin out of her system for a period of time. I think for at least 48 hours, she's completely clean. She has the ibogaine again, and what they describe in the film is that she kind of regresses into a young child again, and she actually talks like a young child. And this period of regression lasts, I think, 24 or 48 hours. And then after she comes out, she's literally cured of her heroin addiction. And not only that, but she doesn't have the withdrawal symptoms, because one of the big problems with things like heroin and cocaine addiction is the withdrawal that the victims feel when the drug, no longer taking the drug. But the ibogaine or the iboga seems to just circumvent that completely, and it's one of the most powerful treatments for drug addiction that's become known. So again, this seems to take place, at least in part, through some sort of reset of your consciousness, your brain, and having this experience of expanded consciousness.
Okay, now if there is a soul which can reincarnate after we've died, and there's an afterlife or a non-physical realm, then we could maybe get clues about this from people who've had near-death experiences, because we've got examples of people who've been clinically dead who've come back and reported all sorts of things, common things.
Yes.
And there's a list in your book of the many common things that people report. So do you just want to talk about that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there are many websites now devoted to near-death experience, and the understanding is, I think, much greater in the last sort of 40 years. There's been a lot of research and study, and I recommend just before we go into the list of elements of the experience, Dr. Peter Fenwick's books, Jeffrey Long, Dr. Sabom, and we've got obviously people like Raymond Moody as well, and what the people that they've spoken to describe, for example, they have some life-threatening experience, like in a car accident or on the operating table where things go south, and the operation doesn't go well, and then they report hearing sometimes a buzzing or a clicking sound, and then they sometimes then report that they're suddenly outside of their body and they're looking down and they're looking on the operating table and seeing themselves on the operating table with doctors and nurses tending to them, and quite often they will be able to accurately report elements of the conversation that's taking place while they're looking down on their body. One of the cases I report, one of the most well-known cases, is that of Pam Reynolds. And
their heart would have been stopped
at
this
point.
Is stopped, so the brain's not.
The brain is not. There's no oxygen going to the brain. So clinically they're dead. So their normal physical senses should completely stop working. Yet again, they're able to report elements of conversations. Then typically after that, what will happen is they sort of notionally look around, look away or look up, and they see some kind of void but with a light in it. So then they will travel towards this light and they will go through a tunnel of light and get to the other end, and there'll be some boundary of some kind. This boundary is described in various different ways. It might be a fence, it might be a road, it might be going towards a house or something, and then typically they will describe meeting other people and then having a conversation. They will typically then go through a life review where they are shown elements of their life in 3D, and it's all it seems to happen simultaneously. So you start, this is one of the other things, you start to get reports of time just behaved differently, or there is no time. Once you get into these experiences, the sense of time just disappears.
And as I mentioned at the beginning, that might be something real that could be borne out by physics.
Yeah. I mean, if the soul exists in a realm where the physics is different, then of course, the physics of time would be different as well. And then basically, what will happen is they'll maybe meet either a relative, or they might meet a being of light. That's quite a common one as well. Can be identified as Jesus or God or maybe some other deity. Not always, though. Not everyone experiences that. And then they will have a conversation, they'll have a life review, and then a decision will be made that they must return to their bodies, and then they will come back into their bodies and carry on with their physical life. But they quite often have gained memories which they wouldn't have otherwise had. And as I say, the case of Pam Reynolds, she was able to accurately describe an instrument which they used to drill into her skull, a bone saw, and she described that quite accurately. And yet her eyes were covered up, and she had things put in her ears, and those things in her ears were producing a clicking sound because that was part of the way they were shutting down her brain as part of this operation. And so the evidence appears to be that part of her consciousness, Pam Reynolds and many others who have near-death experience, moves outside of the body, at least up to the height of the hospital room ceiling, if not further. And there are reports of other people that have heard conversations sort of half a mile away. In fact, there's another story in the book.
Just to interrupt you there, Andrew, just when they say outside of the body, that suggests that it's in another location in three-dimensional space, like it's above the body or at the side of the body.
It does.
But where is your consciousness when you're in a dream? It might not be in the known three-dimensional space. It could be thinking about that, or having information about what's going on in the, you know, on the operating theatre or wherever they are, but they're not necessarily above their body. They're in a mind space that is perceiving it's there, but they could be in this other realm.
Yeah, you could argue it in that the consciousness is not actually in that place.
Yeah.
But somehow, there is some sort of camera system which is able to view anywhere in the universe, and the consciousness is actually looking through that camera. It's not actually transferred to that.
Like in a dream,
physical,
you can be in any place in a dream.
Yeah, and the other one that's in the book, I won't give too many details here, but is the account of Anita Moorjani, who she died from cancer essentially, and then she was able to return, and she describes what happened to her in her near-death experience, and how she was able to actually see her brother on a plane travelling to where she was.
If that person dies, obviously they can't come back and tell you about it unless they're reincarnated, of course, which you've documented some cases of we discussed earlier. Now, what about this theory, because I think you're not sure about this, that when the body does die, it reduces in weight by 21 grams, which could be indicative that that's how much the soul weighs. Do you think that's plausible?
I decided to put that in the book because I'd been fascinated, because I'd heard this story from David Shayler, actually. It was, and I was surprised that he would be talking about such a thing. That would have been 20 years ago that I'd had that conversation with him. And so I just looked into that, and to see, if the soul is at least partly physical, and if it leaves the body at physical death, then one might surmise that the physical weight of the body would reduce if the soul did indeed move somewhere else. But not very many studies being done on it, and the ones that have been done suggest no, it doesn't. That does not happen.
All right, I'll just read a quote from Manly P. Hall, which sort of encapsulates what we've just been talking about. He says, "The heavy diving suit is the physical body, and the sea the ocean of life. At birth, man assumes the diving suit, but his spirit is always connected by a line to the light above. Man descends into the depths of the sea of sorrow and morality, that he may find there the hidden treasures of wisdom. For experience and understanding are pearls of great price, and to gain them man must beat all things. When the treasure has been found, or his hours of labour are over, he is drawn back into the boat again, and taking off the heavy armour, breathes the fresh air and feels free once more. Wise men realise that this incident we call life is only one trip to the bottom of the sea, and that we have been down many times before and must go down many times again before we find the treasure." So he's saying that you've got to live many lives with the same soul before you sort of, become wise enough to escape.
Yeah, so, it really feels like that we are here to learn certain things and live with the constraints that we have here. But then when we have, say, a near-death experience, we get a sense of what it's like not being here, but still being alive in some form. We seem to be much freer to move around. We have all these amazing abilities to just know things without really having to work to know them. We just kind of can reach out and know it, and access that knowledge.
There's a lot more discussed in the book, including things like the power of positive thinking, and you also cover negative thinking and about the media and about psyops, things which keep your mind imprisoned.
Yeah.
Story of the Wingmakers, which was a discovery of ancient artifacts which allegedly come from some sort of advanced intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those stories that it's easy to write it off as just something that somebody has made up, and that it's some kind of elaborate marketing scheme. I mean, the website, for example, was set up in the early days of the internet, actually, and then it gradually seemed to evolve into some type of website to sell CDs or books, or you could easily, explain it away as that. But again, if you go and study the material, and there's quite a bit of it now has been, sort of transferred into the Internet Archive, as you alluded to there, the story goes that some hikers were going through, I think, Chaco Canyon, which I think is in New Mexico. The locations are all in the book. And they discovered a strange sort of artifact lying in the desert dust. And this essentially led them into a cave system. And this was then explored further and further over, actually, I think about 20 years. And within this cave system, they found several caverns. I think there were 23 caverns, and in each cavern they found various paintings, various artifacts and objects, and they even allegedly found an optical disc which was encoded with information. And this was actually, essentially covered up. The discovery of this was covered up, and So
just to interrupt you there, Andrew, so this discovery it ended up in the hands of the NSA, the
yes,
National Security Agency, which made it all secret and prevented anyone else from finding out about it. But someone in the know has leaked this information.
That's right. So this character called Dr. Anderson allegedly became unhappy with what the NSA was doing, and he took out some of this Wingmaker's material that they'd decoded, and he gave it to this journalist who had a pseudonym of Anne, and then it started to be published on the Wingmaker's website in 1998 by this mysterious character called James, who was later revealed to be James Mahu. And again, it does sound like a bit of a science fiction plot, a bit of a Twilight Zone episode or something. But then when you actually study the material, for example, I was very much intrigued by the way that it kind of classifies world religions in a very sort of straightforward way. I'll try and get you because it's quite quick to read it, and it basically, you think, well, how could somebody have this sort of knowledge to characterise world religions in this way?
And those who have published this, are they making any money out of it?
Well, if they're making money, I don't think they're making much. Some of it did go behind a paywall, but most of the information was actually available for free, at least initially. Let me just see if I can find this quote, and I'll read it out because it's not very long.
So what would you say? Study the material yourself and decide for yourself, sort of thing.
Yeah. So, the Wingmaker material, to me, I would describe it as spiritually advanced. Whoever's written it seems to have studied spirituality and religions very closely, and they're able to kind of understand them very well. And there's one section in the Wingmaker's glossary which talks about models of existence, and it's not very long, I'll just read this out. It says, there are two dominant models of existence that shape the interaction and destiny of the human race. These models of existence are evolution/saviourship model and the transformation mastership model. Each human is developing their belief system from one or both of these models of existence. The evolution saviourship model is the dominant model that is promulgated by the hierarchy, and it describes the hierarchy as kind of like the overarching system that runs everything. Its basic tenets are that life evolves through the hierarchy's teacher-student methodology, and that various teachers or saviours are presented to the human race that enable sub-hierarchies to develop and control information. In so doing, individuals are disempowered and disconnected from their sovereignty. The underlying equation of this evolution saviourship model of existence is human instrument plus hierarchy equals God connection through saviourship. So they're kind of arguing that you establish your connection to God through somebody else, through a religion or a priest or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it goes on. In the case of the transformation mastership model of existence, its principal tenets are that the entity is limitless, deathless and sovereign. All the information flows from source intelligence to the entity, and it is therefore the responsibility of the entity to become self-enlightened and self-liberated by attuning itself to source intelligence and then detuning itself from the hierarchy. Each becomes their own master, and each transforms from a human being to a sovereign integral. This is the terminology that they use to describe individual souls, this sovereign integral concept, within the cradle of time and space. So it's talking about as being held in time and space. The underlying equation of the transformation mastership model of existence is entity plus source intelligence equals prime creator equality. One of the challenges in the individual is to recognize these two dominant models of existence and integrate them in order to design a synthesis model. The synthesis model is slowly emerging on Terra Earth and with high probability will ultimately become the dominant model of existence in this universe. It will be the model of existence that is best able to unify consciousness without impinging on the sovereignty of the entity and prime creator. It will allow the entity to be the vibrant container of source intelligence and explore new fields of vibration as a fully conscious outpost of prime creator. And so that in a short paragraph really it kind of succinctly described what I felt was going on with all of this, with all of our spiritual development. And if you compare, like, so for example, Hinduism to Catholicism, that kind of comparison is embodied in what I've just read out, and so much more as well. I put another quite long quote in the book. I won't read it out here, from Manly P. Hall, that was written probably in the 1940s, 1950s. In fact, no, it was earlier than that, in the 1920s. His book, Secret Teachings of All Ages, and there's a whole passage in that which is quite similar to that. It has very strong parallels, and this is what intrigued me, that you can find such teachings throughout these different religions, and even in supposedly secular teachings like the Wingmakers. That's what one of the things that impressed me about it.
Yeah, now, there are a number of people who've expressed what we're trying to express in this interview in their own way, and one of them is Bill Hicks. So you wanted to read out a few quotes from Bill Hicks just to finish on. Yeah,
well, there's a couple of his quotes which I mean, when I read them, I was kind of blown away, really. I mean, Bill Hicks was this American comedian who died at the age of 33, and there's some mysteries sort of surrounding that I mentioned in the book. So you can find them online as well, but you can read them in my book. But I think it was quite a good quote to put in here because it ties together several of the things that you and I have just been discussing in this interview. And Bill Hicks was this very blue comedian, and in his routines he would just suddenly change the subject from sort of blue humour to talking about, expanded consciousness, basically. He also used to rant about, psychedelic drugs or things like LSD getting a bad rap. And he read out an example of a mainstream news story that you would never have heard being broadcast. And he said, imagine this. Today, a young man on acid realised that all matter is merely energy condensed to a slow vibration, that we are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. There's no such thing as death. Life is only a dream, and we are the imagination of ourselves. Here's Tom with the weather. And so that, to me, it just, in one short sentence, again encapsulates many of the things that that we've been talking about. And again, he in another performance, he summed everything up. This again, I've just put this quote directly in the book, and you can find the video clip of him saying this. The world is like a ride in an amusement park, and when you choose to go on it, you think it's real, because that's how powerful our minds are. And the ride goes up and down and round and round. It has thrills and chills and is very brightly coloured, and it's very loud and it's fun for a while. Some people have been on the ride for a long time. They've begun to question, is this real or is this just a ride? And other people have remembered, and they've come back to us and they say, hey, don't worry, don't be afraid ever, because this is just a ride. And we kill those people. Shut him up. Shut him up. I've got a lot invested in this ride. Look at the furrows of worry on my brow. Look at my big bank account, my family. This has to be real. but it's just a ride. And he talks about the demons running amok, and he says we can change it anytime we want. It's only a choice, no effort, no work, no jobs, no savings of money. A choice right now between fear and love. The eyes of fear want you to put bigger locks on your door, buy guns, close yourself off. The eyes of love instead see all of us as one. Here's what we can do to change the world right now. And he talks about, taking away all the money from defence budgets. And then he says, we can explore space together, both inner and outer, forever in peace. And to see that at the end of a comedy routine, I had to wonder, well, if he's going around saying things like that,
why did he die so young?
Why did he die at the age of 33?
Reminds me of the John Lennon quote that you've got in there as well, which is, if you want peace, then be peaceful.
Well, that's essentially what I think he was saying. That I think was my paraphrasing of him, really. But yes, you need to have inner peace before you can have outer peace, I think, yes.
Right. Good advice. And thank you for coming in, Andrew, to discuss the book. It's quite different from the topics that we normally discuss, which usually are quite depressing. The things that we have revealed, they're not. We're revealing. We have revealed a lot of evil in the world, but this book is entirely different. It's the opposite, really. So hopefully people find it enlightening, positive. Maybe if you're in pain or struggling in life or what have you, perhaps reading this might just give you a slightly different perspective on reality.
I hope so.
Okay, all right, Andrew. So remember, believe none of what you hear and question everything you see. I'm Richard D. Hall. Good night.